Well, Kevin, one of our goals with this show is to make people feel smarter about artificial intelligence.
Yes.
But recently, a study that we saw asked the question, what if AI is actually making us dumber?
See, this is the kind of hard-hitting research we need.
Yeah, I agree with you. So this study was put together through a collaboration between Carnegie Mellon University and Microsoft Research. And we truly were so fascinated by it because as enthusiastic as we sometimes feel about the uses of AI, I think both of us have had the sneaking suspicion that maybe it is not making us better critical thinkers.
I do think on a sort of macro level that AI has made me smarter and more capable, but I also take seriously the possibility that something is happening to my brain that I don't quite realize. And so I'm glad that researchers are now looking at what is going on inside our brains when we use AI.
Yeah. Do you remember in like the sort of late 80s, early 90s, and there were those PSAs on TV that would say, this is your brain on drugs, and it would just be an egg frying in a pan?
No, because I'm less than 40 years old.
Oh,
but
right.
I'm
well,
sure you do.
Look it up on YouTube. It was an iconic commercial, and you have to ask yourself, what if AI was a frying pan and our brain was an egg, what would be happening to that egg if they made a PSA in 2025? Anyways, so look, we have talked about this problem in the context of education before, right, Kevin? When we've talked to educators on the show, this is one of the questions that we're asking is, how are our students going to ever develop critical thinking skills if they're just defaulting to tools like ChatGPT? What this study says is, hey, guess what? This is not only going to be an issue for like students, Kevin, it's also you and me. So now, Kevin, you're probably wondering, what do these researchers study?
What are these researchers studying?
Thank you for
Tell me
asking
about this study.
So the researchers surveyed 319 people. This is they had diverse ages, genders, occupations. They lived in different countries. What they had in common, though, was that they all used tools like ChatGPT at least once a week. And the researchers asked them to each share 3 real examples of how they had used AI at work in that week. And then the researchers did a bunch of analysis of what the subjects had shared with them. In particular, Kevin, the researchers asked the participants, did you engage in critical thinking when you were performing these tasks? How much effort do you feel like you were putting into it when you were using AI and when you weren't using AI? And how confident were you that the AI that you were using was doing this task correctly? The idea here was to get a window into very real work settings, so not some sort of, hypothetical lab test, but actually go into people's jobs and say, okay, you're using this tool at work, and how did you feel about it?
And what did they find?
So, number one, when people trust AI more, they use fewer of their critical thinking skills, right? And this sort of makes intuitive sense to you. If you ask ChatGPT a question and you basically know the answer, you may not be scrutinizing it quite as hard, right? At the same time, there is now the risk that if ChatGPT does make a mistake and you were overconfident in it, then all of a sudden that mistake is going to become your mistake.
Right.
But if you extrapolate forward, Kevin, what makes this interesting is that the more that people are trusting in AI, and if you assume AI is going to get better, you probably are going to trust it more over time, it sort of changes the nature of your job fundamentally. And you are no longer doing the tasks you were hired to do, and you are doing more of what these researchers are calling AI oversight.
Yeah, I mean, this is similar to something I've heard from software engineers who are using AI coding tools in their jobs. And I had one of them tell me recently that they feel like their job has changed from coding to managing a coder. And that just strikes me as something that's going to potentially happen across many more jobs.
Absolutely. I've heard the same thing from coders, and I believe it. So that leads to the second finding, which is just the reverse of the first one, which is when you trust AI less, you tend to think more critically. So you're using this tool, but it's maybe not performing the way that you think it's going to, or you're just less confident that you think it can do something. You're going to engage those critical thinking skills. So where does this net out? Well, basically, it's that as AI improves, the expectation is that human beings are going to do less critical thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly reasonable conclusion to draw from this. And obviously, I want to see many more studies of this kind of thing. And I also want to see studies that are not just based on like asking people if they feel like they're thinking less, but actually are measuring things like test scores or performance on certain tasks. Like, I would love to fast forward 5 years from now and be able to see whether or not the use of generative AI in all these jobs has actually made people less capable at their jobs.
Yeah, and that raises a good point, which is we should tell you a few limitations of this research. This is just one study. They only talked to English speakers, and as you mentioned, Kevin, this study just relied on workers' own subjective perceptions of what they were doing versus some sort of, I don't know, more rigorous empirical method. But that said, a lot of what they find resonates with me because I've experienced this myself, right? When I'm doing sort of non-work related things with an AI, maybe I'm exploring a little research project for my own curiosity, or I'm having it help me think through something.
Creating a novel bioweapon?
When I'm creating a novel bioweapon, something that would put anthrax to shame just in terms of its pure destructive force, I can feel myself sort of ceding the chemical engineering skills that I would normally bring to that task to this AI, and I feel that that's making me a worse biohacker over time.
Yeah, I've felt something similar, not with novel bioweapons, but just with the sort of tasks that I'm using AI for. Obviously, we've talked about the things that I would not be able to do that AI has now made me capable of doing, like vibe coding. We've done several shows on that now. But there are also things that I used to do that I no longer do because AI does it for me.
Like what?
So one of those things would be like preparing for an interview on this podcast. Now, as a regular course of preparing for when we have a guest on, I will often ask for suggestions of questions for that guest from Claude or ChatGPT or one of these other systems. And, sometimes they're not very good, but sometimes they're like 85, 90% as good as one that I would come up with myself. And so I will just use that as the basis for the question that I end up asking, or they'll sort of set me thinking in a new direction.
That makes sense because, when you ask every guest, as you always do, will you free me from this virtual prison? I'm now realizing that that's actually the AI that's asking that, and you've just repeated that verbatim. The vibe coding example, though, is interesting because I think that it shows the inverse of this research, which is I do see a world where you take something where your critical skills aren't going to get you anywhere, which is writing software, a thing that neither you nor I know how to do, and it sort of invites you into the learning process because it says, hey, I'm going to do most of this, but in the process of me doing this, you actually are going to learn something and it's going to make you better and you're going to bring more critical thinking to it than you ever would have previously.
Yeah, I think the complicating detail there is like what happens to people who are actually employed as software engineers if they are leaning on these tools. Are they becoming worse at the thing that they actually do as the core function of their job? And I think we're starting to see anecdotal evidence that they are. You mentioned the other day this post from this person who was claiming that today's junior coders are showing up to work not really knowing how to code, or at least code well, because they're so reliant on these AI tools. And it makes me think of kind of what happened in the aviation industry after the invention of autopilot. The FAA in 2013 issued a safety alert basically expressing their concern that pilots were becoming too reliant on automation and autopilot systems and that they were losing their manual flying skills. That's a pretty well-documented phenomenon, this kind of skill atrophy. As the AIs get better in your area of expertise, you do less of the work yourself.
Yeah, and I'm so conflicted about how to feel about this, Kevin, because on one hand, this is kind of what we want AI tools to do. We want them to take away the drudgery. We want them to do the first 10 or 20 or 30% of a task and let us focus on the things that we really excel at. So part of me, when I hear AI, makes you use your critical thinking skills less, I think, okay, that just means the technology is developing the way that it's supposed to. I think the question is, what is that threshold where the AI is starting to do so much that it almost causes an existential crisis in the human or the worker, and you think, what value am I actually bringing to this equation anymore?
Totally. Did the researchers who put out this study have any ideas about what to do about generative AI and critical thinking?
They did. So they suggest that AI labs, product makers try to create some kind of feedback mechanism that, number one, helps users gauge the reliability of the output. This is something we've talked about on the show before. How nice would it be if when you got an answer from a chatbot, it said, by the way, I'm only 70% confident that this is true. I'll tell you, if I saw that, that would make me engage my critical thinking skills way more, right? So I think that's a pretty good idea. You could imagine an AI company inserting a little prompt like, hey, did you check these sources sources? Do you want to see competing perspectives? It also suggests that they could interrupt the user and ask little questions like, did you check the sources? Do you want to see other perspectives? How are you going to put this into your own voice? So essentially encouraging people who are using chatbots to remember to bring their own human perspective into their work.
Do you think that would actually work?
I would say it probably depends on the worker. Maybe you're the sort of worker that's just trying to blow through your tasks as quickly as you can so you can get home and watch Netflix, But I think if you're somebody who is trying to do a good job, and maybe you're going to feel more pressure to do that in a world where everyone is using LLMs really successfully, I think those encouragements might inspire you to do better work.
Yeah. I also wonder if people will start trying to sort of go to the mental equivalent of the gym, like whether they will have
You mean doing the Wordle every morning?
Is that what the gym looks like for you?
That's what I've been doing.
So I just think that there's going to be some point at which we start feeling uncomfortable about how much of our cognition we are outsourcing to these tools. And I don't think we've arrived there yet for most people, but I do know people in San Francisco who are starting to use this stuff much more than I do and much more than maybe they would have 6 months ago. And I think that at a certain point, those people will feel like, hey, maybe I haven't actually had an original thought of my own in many weeks or months. And maybe they will start incorporating, I don't know, some time into their day when they shut off all the chatbots and they just sit there and they try to have some ideas of their own.
So I think having ideas of your own is absolutely something everybody should be trying to do. But I feel so conflicted, Kevin, because I think of a world where hopefully in a year or two, I'm going to have the equivalent of the best editor in the entire world living on my laptop, right? Or accessible to me via some sort of service. And I say, I want to write a story about this. Help me plan it out. Who should I talk to? What are the questions I should ask? Or here's the reporting I've done so far. What would be some really fun ways to structure it? Or look at my writing. How would you fix this? And if that editor can elevate my content, I shouldn't say content. If my editor can elevate my story to the next level, I'm going to want to do that, even if I have to admit that I didn't do a lot of the critical thinking to get me there. So I think this is just honestly a real unanswered question is what is the value that we want to bring to the work that we're doing when these systems become more powerful?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I would also love to hear from our listeners about what they are experiencing as they use AI more in their lives and in their jobs.
As you're using AI in your work, are you worrying at all that your critical thinking skills might be atrophying a bit? Or do you feel the reverse, that using AI is helping you learn more and expand your skill set?
Yeah, I would also love to hear from, frankly, teachers and people who are managing or overseeing people who are using lots of generative AI, and whether you think the students or the employees that you're seeing use this stuff are changing as a result of their use. Send us a voice memo or an email telling us about your experience, and we might include it in an upcoming show.
Together we may survive the singularity. That's how I'd like to end all of our listener callouts. Together, we may survive the singularity.
Everything is computer.
Everything is computer. Hey, that's the end of this clip. If you liked what you saw, head on over to our page and subscribe, and you can get the full podcast. We do a show like this almost every week on tech and the future. Head on over there now and subscribe.